So we have a guest lecture. We are fortunate to have David Smith, who is the founder and CEO of Affordable Housing Institute, and it develops like sustainable housing financial ecosystems worldwide. With 45 years of direct experience in affordable housing, David uniquely combines the role of practitioner and participant and a policymaker. He is an award-winning author with more than 400 published articles in real estate valuation and policy periodicals and textbook, as well as a influential blog. His work as an international housing finance policy advisor, program developer, encompass projects in 30 countries, including Brazil, Colombia, Egypt, India, Indonesia, Ireland, Jordan, Kenya, Mexico, Mongolia, Morocco, Panama, Sri Lanka, South Africa, Turkey, UAE, Vietnam, and the UK. So I met him in a conference at Harvard in 2014, and I have seen his videos during my PhD. Surprised to see him in reality, and he graciously welcomed me and invited me to visit his office. Since then, I have been taking guidance from him, and he, instead of having busy and crazy schedule, always helped me out. I'm giving the mic to you, David. Now, kindly enlighten us with your knowledge. Thank you.
Well, that's very kind of you, Dr. Fariha. I appreciate it, and I want to thank you and thank UMT for asking me to do a talk. I have spent 45 years, as Dr. Fariha kindly pointed out, in the subject of affordable housing and how you get more of it. And for me, it never gets old. So for those of you who are in the housing class and are thinking about housing as something that might be part of your future, I really commend you. It will not be boring. And if you do it well, you change people's lives for the better. So I want to talk a little bit about that. I know that you want to be able to break your fast in an hour and a half. I promise I will be done with the presentation part of this in plus or minus 30 minutes. So there will be a good interval of time for Q&A. The slides that you see here, as soon as the presentation is over, I will turn them into a PDF and send them. I don't like to send them ahead of time because sometimes there are typographical errors or other challenges with them. So I will send all of that. I will send all of that forward, and depending on how the discussion goes, I have written an enormous number of things, as Dr. Fariha mentions, and if there are some of them that I think might be helpful, I'll be happy to include them in a further email, and she can post them on your class website or the like. I've left this picture up here because I want you to have a little bit of context. For those of you who would not know, the photograph is of my hometown of Boston. And the monument in the background is the Bunker Hill Monument. That's a very famous site in America where one of the first battles of the Revolutionary War was fought. And beyond that are the high rises of the Central Business District of Boston. In the foreground is public housing that was built in 1940, 81 years ago, by the US government and has since then been run by the city of Boston. It has not really been renovated in that 80 years, and it is dilapidated. It is not good housing now. It's going to be completely demolished and rebuilt on the same site into 2,700 apartments with mixed income housing and with all the public housing tenant people able to return. And I put that picture up there because it's a nice illustration of how close the very poorest people in America can live to the Central Business District and the most important people, at least in the state of Massachusetts. And yet these are two different worlds. And I've spent a lot of time trying to figure out how to make the world in the foreground better and connect it to the world in the background. So with that, assuming I can get my thing to work, why aren't we? Whoops, sorry. There we go. At the time I sent the bio to Dr. Fariha. Um, it had been 30 countries, but I'm now up to just about 50 countries. We did a little bit of work with the government of Pakistan via the British bilateral agency, the Department for International Development, at least that's what it was called back then. I've highlighted on here some of the other countries that are not completely different from Pakistan. So we worked extensively in India. We worked in the Maldives, which you may know is a Muslim country down off the coast of India, an archipelago. I've worked in affordable housing in Dubai and in Morocco and in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. And it's significant for this discussion that all of these places have affordable housing challenges. Everybody's affordable housing challenge is different, just like everybody's culture is different, but they all drive from the same kind of forces. And I've spent, as it says there, 45 years doing financial transactions to improve the quality of affordable housing, to make it more physically and economically and socially sustainable. And I keep doing that. And here's the first big idea. I've only got about 8 big ideas in this presentation, but you folks are all in a management school and an urban planning and a real estate school. The first idea, housing is where jobs go to sleep at night. And any place that you see traffic jams, when you see traffic jams, that's a consequence of 2 things. One is that the city got bigger than the people who planned it thought it would ever get. And the second thing that happens is that the jobs and the homes became farther and farther apart in space. And traffic jams represent the commute between home and work. And everybody who works has to commute twice a day. And those commutes get longer and longer and longer and more crowded and more polluted unless the housing is close to the jobs. So it's really important as one thinks about affordable housing to figure out, to watch how the economy grows. This is an equation I put up to get you to remember. 1 equals 1 plus 1. If your economy adds 1 job, you had better add 1 home and 1 round trip commute. And the other equation is 5 to 1. For every high income job a society creates, it creates 5 middle to low income jobs. So we have 1 job of the kind that mayors and governors and members of parliament love, and 5 more that make everything work together. And so housing exists to make this affordable because the rent eats first. People who live in cities, they spend their money getting to and from their work, and they spend it on housing. And that eats up 60% of people's budget. And for very poor people, it can eat up 80% of their budget. And people have to live on what's left. When people have more income, they spend it on their food, they spend it on their kids and their kids' education, and they spend it on health. So if you want a better future society, you want parents to be able to spend more on their food, for nutrition, and their children's education and their health. And to do that, there has to be affordable housing. And here's the thing. It always costs money to create affordable housing. In fact, the more successful your city is, the faster it grows, the more jobs it creates, the more people it will attract, the more spending they will have, and the value of land gets more expensive. So as the economy goes up, affordability goes down. Growing economies make housing affordability worse. And the market by itself will never produce enough fast enough. If you do the land use economics, office buildings, commercial properties, industrial, research and development, hotels, they all produce a higher projected value. For those of you who are business school students or economic students, the housing is adversely selected within real estate development. Everything else is a higher value of land, and affordable housing is less valuable than residential housing. So you have this paradox that if you want housing to be affordable, and thank you, Sana Malik, for putting that comment in the chat, okay? If you want housing to be affordable, government has to be involved. And this is really complicated. It's really, really complicated because if you don't, here's what happens. Sorry for having the caption there without a picture on it. Fast growing cities always create slums. People move to the city for the opportunity. Landlords are maximizing their net operating income. And so you get unsanitary conditions, you get overcrowding. The other thing that you get, and and there are two places in the world this is particularly true, but if you have informal legal status, then you will work informally and you'll be paid in cash. And if you work informally and are paid in cash, you will live in informal housing. And if you live in informal housing, nearly all of the time it will be overcrowded. And the people who live in it will be exploited. And that is a public health hazard aside from being not a good thing. And the two places, you'll see this in a minute, I'll show you two places in the world where this was really brought home to me. So the pictures that I've put up here are from London and from New York. They were taken, the London drawing down in over the lower left-hand corner was done in the 1870s. Notice that you have the entire family living in one room. You have the children playing, the mother working, the father tired because he's gone off to work and come home in the day. The washing is being done and they all live in one room. And you will notice in that photograph, there's no bathroom. When you have overcrowding, when you have informal housing, toilets and sanitation are in short supply. The picture immediately to its right is from Manhattan in the 1890s. And those are Central European immigrants who have made it to America, and they all live in one room together. Next to them are homeless children, orphans. They were called street urchins in New York. They're called street Arabs in London. And farther lower right-hand corner picture is garbage piling up in alleyways. And so I put this picture up because I want you to understand that always, 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 it doesn't matter whether it's Lahore or Karachi or Ahmedabad or Cape Town or Manhattan, if the city is growing rapidly, there will be slums. And the slums sometimes happen in Makkah. That is informal self-built housing rising on the outskirts of Makkah. And on the right, that is housing that once was formal but has become informal in Los Angeles. That's conventional housing. Those are both market solutions. In the lower left, that's the old city of Jeddah. Jeddah is an old city. It's a Hijazi city. Jeddah, as you know, is a port. It's the entry for many pilgrims on the Hajj going to Makkah. And it has wonderful Ottoman and Hijazi architecture. And the oldest part of the city is also the most rundown. And so that was formal and has become informal. And in the lower right, that's Los Angeles. That is housing that was built and owned and operated by the government, by the city of Los Angeles, with no debt on it. And it's a slum too. And so I put these pictures up, not to blame anybody, but simply to say, you always have to be in the affordable housing business. A country does, a nation does, okay? And here's why. In the rural environment, in a place where there's plenty of land, housing is a physical product. You build it incrementally. In America, we have the tradition of the log cabin. In many other places, you have the tradition of pitching a tent and then making a tent more formal. So we did work, for example, in Mongolia, where they have yurts, as they're called in English, or gurs, as they're called in Mongolian. And those were movable tents. Okay. But once you get into an urban environment, housing becomes a formal product and it is created on an assembly line. You start with raw material, land and infrastructure and building materials. I saw a question in the chat about are different building materials, do better building materials make it possible to have cheaper housing? And the answer is, in effect, part of the time. But that's only one of the 8 things, and I'll show you the rest of the 8 in a minute. Beyond the raw material, you have all these concepts of law, property title, zoning, urban planning, construction contracts, and what I call risk acceptance. Because to build housing, to develop housing is risky. I'll come back to that. And the product, the home that is created, is always more valuable in the aggregate than its raw materials are worth. That's why people become developers. Housing is expensive. Urban housing is very expensive. In every developed nation, housing costs at least 4 times annual salaries. And nobody can pay. No, normal people can't pay 4 times an annual salary. Okay. So you take out a loan to buy housing. It's a product that universally in urban environments, people who want to own it borrow money. And that's another kind of product which has its own raw material and its own construction. I'll talk about that, its own development. Muhammad Ahad Elahi, I see your note about rapid and viable housing in mountainous regions. We can come back to that. It's important. Your question is a good one because it highlights for you the challenge of land and development land and site infrastructure. Okay. I also saw a question from Abdul Rauf about how you tackle the problem of lower income housing. I'll try to cover that in Q&A. Hint, it takes subsidy. So here's a little diagram, and we have more material on this. The chain has 8 links. This diagram on the top, there are 8 links on the demand side, which is people's ability to pay. And there are 8 links on the supply side, which is how homes get created. Okay. And these value chain links, I talked about universals, these apply everywhere in the world, and they apply formally and informally, and they can be studied. And we developed the thoughtware around this, and we have material on this that I will send so that you can read it if you want. So follow the demand side. Okay, demand side works like this. We're going to turn what's called in the economist speak effective demand. Effective demand means there's a household, and the household wants a home, wants to move into the home, and effective demand means they have an ability to pay and a willingness to pay a certain amount per month. Okay? The demand side value chain has to figure out who they are and figure out how to get them a loan. So it starts with eligibility. What households are we trying to get to move into the property? You've asked several questions here about poor people and low income housing. Eligibility is particularly challenging for lower income people because their need, what they deserve as human beings, is greater than their ability to pay. So immediately after eligibility, you have to get them to apply. If for those of you, who've been following COVID around the world, you can have a vaccine, but you have to get people to want the vaccine. In the same way, people who are eligible for housing have to believe they can get it and want to apply for it. They're going to need subsidy. Sana Malik put the question into chat, and I will mention it again. Almost everywhere in the world, middle income and low income people get subsidy assistance to pay for housing in one form or another. They have to qualify. So you have to go through an underwriting process. People have to validate your ability to pay, your effective demand. Okay. You have to create a loan, which we'll talk about, and there has to be a closing for the loan, meaning the family shows up, the lender shows up, the money shows up, a lot of pieces of paper are signed, the loan is funded. I'll skip that part. Once you've got the loan, you have to pay every month. And if you don't, there has to be some enforcement. So those are the 8 steps on the demand side. And it's a little more complicated in rental, but fundamentally the same. On the supply side, it starts with land. You have land and you envision a home that you want to build and you want to sell to somebody. The site can accommodate homes. Construction has to be possible, legally and physically possible. There's going to be a person who does that, and that person is called a developer, and the developer has to be motivated and has to take a risk, has to take a bunch of risks. And so it starts with getting land, and the developer has to secure what's called in the trade site control, which is rights to build on it. It has to be serviced land, so it has to be graded, it has to be drained, it has to have roads running to it, has to have water on the site, has to have some form of sanitation, has to have electricity. Okay? It has to be laid out because inside the site, you're going to need interior roads and interior trunk infrastructure. Okay? It has to be designed. That's where the architects come in. It has to be, somebody has to decide to borrow all the money and put the equity in and start to build it. And that process is called risk assumption. If you've ever seen a property get started and not finished, if you've ever seen a developer go bankrupt, you know that once you embark on this, it's like skiing or something. Once you start construction, you had bloody well better finish, because if you don't, you crash. And it's very expensive to crash. You got to build it. You got to build it right. It's got to not fall down. You have to sell it to a customer, and then it has to be managed. Okay? And so those 2 steps, those 2 things have to come together. And in the world of housing, you have to get free money. It comes in cash forms and comes in non-cash forms. The reason I have the picture in the upper right of ice and water vapor is because there are non-cash forms of money that you can turn into cash. You change its state. That's important. The lower right picture of the man pulling a rabbit out of a hat and the rabbit is pulling a man out of a hat and so on is part of the thing about real estate is you can make money in the sky. You actually can manufacture money. That's why when it's done well, it becomes very profitable. But when it's not done well, you lose a lot of money. I see Mutahir Awan's comment that you have to make it possible for low-income housing to be as valuable for someone to develop as market housing. And you do that by adding either grants or favorable loans with high gearing or interest subsidy, a favorable interest rate, or deferred repayment or tax or certain kinds of incentives or subsidies for the tenant or otherwise. And on the non-cash side, you start with land. A comment was put in, Khurram Farid put in a comment about state ownership or something or other is a must. Certainly, availability of cheap land is a must to get the process started if you want to have low income housing. You need to have sufficient density and sufficient zoning, which is usually controlled by government. All of these other elements, utilities costs may have been mentioned. There was a mention by Khurram Farid about duties and taxes. There are countries in which VAT, value-added tax, or other forms of taxes are not charged on housing that is affordable housing according to some program. That creates lift, that adds value, and you can have tax relief on real estate taxes and fees. I could spend hours on this. I just want you to understand the idea. There is money, and it can be turned from non-cash forms into cash forms if you know what you're doing. The study of each market is particular. And we have done this all over the world. I've tried it with cities, I've tried it with countries. We actually map these two value chains and map the resources that go into them. And so it's an ongoing need. This is I will do this one a little bit quickly. Market housing. Sorry, Hamza, would you please mute? Thank you. Market housing always improves. The house you grew up in will not be as good as the one your children grow up in because of broadband, because of better building materials. Consumer desires create more effective demand. When we emerge from our little disease problem, you're going to have a lot more working at home, living at home, shopping at home, and so on. And housing will consume a bigger part of people's budget. The government enables or disables these two value chains at every single link. Often, the government disables housing value chains, unfortunately, because it doesn't know about them. It doesn't think all the way through. By the way, Dr. Fariha, the students are putting fantastic questions into the chat. When we get done with this whole thing, I would like the chat run of show, because I'm not sure I will be able to answer all the questions during the discussion, but I will try to write short answers to the questions afterwards as an after material. So all of you students, I want to commend you all. You're doing a fantastic job of asking the right questions, and it makes me feel bad that I don't have more time with you. Okay, and so affordable housing is an ongoing need. It is a chronic condition. Government has to enable, government has to be aware of the development barriers, and government has to deal with subsidy resources at the margin. I should mention also, I did not have time to put it in, but Halima Shahid asked a good question. There are people who are already living in informal housing. How do you tackle with them to give them formal housing? And the answer is, in stages, you formalize the informal. I don't have a slide on this. I meant to put it in, but you formalize the informal. And I will send you, the guys, the deck that I did when I talked at a World Bank Global Housing Finance Conference. I'll just send it to you in its raw form. You can see your way through it. But everywhere in the world, slums slowly formalize. Sometimes they speedily formalize. You have to do that in addition to all your new production. The business never goes out of style. The work is never done. Now, in the emerging world, there's a few things. By the way, the picture in the upper right is a photograph I took in Kenya. I was in Nairobi, and I particularly liked this photograph. The Ministry of Lands and Housing wanted me to know that their offices were now corruption-free zones. And I felt all better knowing I was walking into a place where there was going to be no corruption. I particularly liked, I think you can see it there on the right, the fellow with the checklist and the pencil behind his ear to check off that he shouldn't give a bribe. I thought that was remarkably charming. Anyway, in the emerging world, you have the problem of traditional title, communal title, tribal title. You have the phenomenon of gecekondu, which is the Turkish term for informal permanent tenure. You have the problem of affermage, which is a French term that means long-term land leases. Land title systems are often anachronistic. Zoning and rights to build. The code will often be out of date. Building codes tend to be written by engineers, and the technology changes. Infrastructure delivery is sometimes unreliable, and sometimes you have to create a little bit of an incentive, a douceur, something to get your infrastructure in place on time. Eminent domain or expropriation, the taking of property. This is a subject that's too big to cover here, but as cities get larger, it is a valid power of government to clear slums and reassemble land. However, when that is used, it is usually used by the powerful against the powerless. So even though it's necessary, it's like dynamite. It's dangerous and is often used poorly. And then lastly down here, informality is a road to formality. We are all sinners, and if we go to heaven, we get there by gradually formalizing the informal housing. What I would advise to anybody who is working in an informal community, tell people to make their homes more durable, tell them to improve their homes as best they can, and tell them to be visible. Because when the poor in large groups become visible, then the phrase I've heard in many places, we are poor, but so many. In India, we've done a lot of work in India. Your mileage may vary. I find it very interesting that you have in India the Dabawala system, the system of direct daily lunches. It's an amazingly good system. But think about how much of a challenge that creates when you have COVID as an environment. And think about what happens when you have these essential workers who can't work because they'll get sick. So as you think about information and vaccines, we find that when India went on lockdown the first time, 80 million people were on the roads when lockdown hit. And they got stranded there, and it became a national crisis that they never thought of. The other thing that happened with migrant and seasonal workers in India is massive internal remittances. And you may well have the same thing in Pakistan. Often you have people where some people move to the city and send money back home to build housing. But you also have in the emerging world, in India and Pakistan, where you have generation skipping technology. The app there is an Indian app, which is a contact tracing app. Obviously, you have the ability to test people for COVID right on the street. And I also want to call your attention to this one. Indoor plumbing and women's issues rise dramatically in a COVID environment or in an epidemic or pandemic environment. I use this case of India not to say anything about India in particular, but the problems in India are illustrative of emerging countries. So I said I'd do it in half an hour. I'm going to do it a couple more minutes than that, but we'll have good time for questions, I hope. Some things to remember. First of all, cities need affordable housing, and slums only go away with conscious effort and patience. Second, slums will always be there, so it takes all the effort you can take to improve housing. The business will never go out of style. It always costs free money. And the best kind of free money to get are the non-cash forms because they're easier to get and you can make money with them, particularly zoning and upzoning and urban planning. Housing loans and housing units are products. It's worth understanding their value chains. In an emerging nation, you need a mortgage law that's well enforced. You need strong rule of law as it relates to property. You need land titling systems and a land cadastre because then you can have mortgage products. All of these things are fundamental to creating large formal housing at scale. And then you need lenders and quantity surveyors and mortgage brokers and real estate agents. There are a lot of professions, low white collar and high white collar professions related to making housing systems work. The good news is the 21st century offers all kinds of opportunities for dramatic and fast improvement. I do think that mobile banking, sophisticated portable apps, GPS, social media, have the ability to give people voice and connectedness and network connections. And I guess my last thing would be, we're all in this together on planet Earth, and the only healthy planet is one that has no slums. They're not going to be eliminated in my lifetime, and goodness knows what we do at AHI isn't going to eliminate them at all, but much. But you got to start somewhere, and you got to work on it. I've worked on it my whole life. I don't get tired of it. I get up in the morning every day. I don't even commute to work anymore. I'm working from home. But I think about this stuff about 11 hours a day, including weekends. And so it is now over to you. It's time for questions, and I'm going to and you'll get the deck, all of that stuff. I'm going to turn the screen share off just so that I have more opportunity to see all of you. And that way you can see my ugly face and we can have a conversation for the next, whatever that is, 23 minutes. So thank you all. The floor is open.
So the first question is why affordable housing mostly linked with low interest loans, and how we can say a house is affordable while it has been constructed with the same materials which is using in other houses. So
Okay. Yep, I got it. It's a two-part question. One part was on the demand side, another part was on the supply side. I want to say hello to my good friend Rizvi, who I see has phoned in. Thanks
Just
very
one quick comment. You are
sure.
as old or as young. I have seen you 20 years before. So,
Thank you, Rizvi. I appreciate that. And you too. Absolutely. May you live for
thank
a
you. So
thousand
kind.
years, right?
So
Okay.
kind of you.
Um, so let's talk about the loan issue and the materials issue. People pay a certain amount of money per month for their housing cost. That amount of money per month gets turned into a lump sum of money to buy a house because someone lends the money. So I'm doing the monthly payments, bump, 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 and the big lump sum here. Okay. The arithmetic by which that chunk of payments turns into this is related to an interest rate. When the interest rate is high, this stream of payments turns into a small lump sum. When the interest rate is low, it turns into a larger lump sum. So as interest rates go down, the same amount of effective demand supports more loan and therefore more purchase price. Sounds great, doesn't it? Except that if everybody's interest rates go down, then not only do the poor can the poor afford a higher priced home, so can the rich. And so if you just simply put in low interest rates across the board and everybody gets them, all the housing prices go up and all the land prices go up. Okay. And so what you want to do if you're trying to give the poor a leg up is you want to give them a lower interest rate than the rich. Now, that is absolutely backwards to a banker. A banker says, I want to give my lowest rate to my safest customer, who's my richest customer. The government says, I want to give my lowest rate to my poorest customers so they can stretch out. But when you do that, the poorer people are, the more there is a risk that they will default. So when the government loans are used and when they have a lower interest rate, if the government is involved, the government will have some form of credit enhancement. So that's the homes and loans question. The question that you asked about building materials, there's two parts to the answer. Maybe three parts. First part, if you make building materials cheaper, you will make housing cheaper only if you don't allow the price of land to rise, because that's often what happens, and only if you don't let the developer sell it in the market. Because developers, they sell the product. When you buy food at the grocery store, you don't ask somebody how much did it cost to grow the food. You look at the price and you compare it next to the price at the next grocery store. So if you want to use cheaper building materials, the first challenge is you have to have that in the context of a program in which the object of the exercise is to control the price of the finished product. So they can be used in government housing programs and the like. So that's first idea, okay, about cheaper materials. The second idea, there is a lot of thought and effort being put into green materials, less carbon dioxide, higher R factor insulation, not using cement, which, as you know, cement is very energy. It's a big energy consumer to make cement. Some green materials and some green initiatives, solar panels and the like, have a higher cost up front and a lower cost over time. That will pencil out to being a favorable return on investment. So if you're somebody like me who's got enough cash to be able to do that and who can do the arithmetic, we'll put the solar panel in because we'll save money over time. Well, we have that luxury because we have the cash to do it. Poor people, A, don't necessarily have that luxury. They can't raise a big lump sum to save money over time. And B, they may not be confident that they will be there in 3 years to enjoy the savings. They may face the risk of eviction. They may have to move to another city, right? There's all of these kind of things. They may also fear that it won't work, that it works great now, but it'll break. Solar panels, for example, they don't always break, but they get crud on them. And when you get crud on a solar panel, its performance drops very rapidly. So in my experience, if you want poor people to have green initiatives, the people who are designing the program have to make the monthly cost with the green initiatives no greater than the monthly cost without them. And that's one where you can use a tax incentive or an interest rate subsidy or a special form of financing um, to make it possible to improve on all of that. The third part about it, I've run into cultures and societies where people like traditional building materials because they grew up with them. And if you introduce new materials, people think they're cheap and they think they are flimsy and they will fall down. So if you're going to lead in this whole thing, you have to lead by example and you have to encourage the market. It's all doable, but it's a challenge. Next question,
Okay,
please.
so the next two questions are about the housing structure and like architecture. So we can leave it like and jump onto the more intense question. Like you have 45 years of experience. So what mostly issues you face in Asian countries while doing your project, and how the governments tackle out even if you figure out the problem. So how can you facilitate the low income and
In
yeah,
Asian
yeah.
countries. Okay. Well, let's see. First one, um, and this is not unique to Asian countries, but I'm very aware of it in Asian countries. Family size and the age pyramid. You know those diagrams that you sometimes see where each row is people from 0 to 5, and then 5 to 10, and 10 to 15, and so on. And it goes on two sides. One side is men, and the other side is women. In the United States, our pyramid looks like this. American households, we don't have a lot of kids, and people live a long time. In emerging countries, particularly South and Southeast Asian countries, there's a much wider pyramid, many, many more children. Additionally, because you have many more children, you have larger family sizes. So you will have the father, the mother, and 4 kids, family of 6. And you may have, in many places, multi-generational households. So a three-generation household, right? Parents, children, grandparents. The poorer the society in general, the larger the family size and the larger the household size in the housing. As a society becomes more affluent, as the income rises, all sorts of things happen. Household size gets smaller, family size gets smaller, household size gets smaller, people consume more housing, they get married later in life. This is gross oversimplification, but that's what happens. What that means is that housing that is built for a compound style or for a 3-generation family of 8 or 9 people won't necessarily be the right housing for a family of 4 people, a nuclear family, as they would call it. So we see an awful lot of evolution of that. The other thing that we see in the Asian countries is really rapid urbanization, particularly in Southeast Asia. Ho Chi Minh City just completely boomed. Indonesia has, Jakarta is, extremely large, rapidly growing cities. So my experience in Latin America urbanized faster. It urbanized in the 50s and 60s. Asia's future is Latin America's past. And it is very important as South Asian cities grow rapidly to get your urban planning in and get your infrastructure in and get housing that has flexibility in the size and the configuration. You have to plan for what the future will be like. Last thing I want to mention is that some countries, Islamic finance has not advanced to the point where you have good long-term housing related lending. That's important. Almost everything that is used in Western society in mortgage finance can be replicated in Islamic finance between Ijara or Murabaha or Musharaka. The Islamic finance forms achieve the same financial result, but the legal aspects of it need to be there. There needs to be an Islamic finance law, and there needs to be Islamic banking, because ideally housing is not just a physical asset and not just a security asset, but it also becomes a financial asset where people are comfortable that they are building equity in their homes. So that's what I can think of off the top of my head for South Asian and Southeast Asian housing challenges.
So the next one would be a comment from Khurram Farid Saab. And besides money, state ownership to address this vital issue is must. Availability of funds rely on duties and taxes. Construction loans are must. So it would add to your like comments on government support. So the next question is from Mutahir Awan. I agreed housing is an expensive product, but at the same time, return on investment. That's why developers do the financial hedging and make it even more unaffordable for low income group. So
Yes,
what's the
let's understand what a developer is. In
yeah?
general, a developer is a carnivore who goes to try to find the most money, the most profit with the least amount of the developer's own money and the least amount of the developer's own risk. The term in America is OPM financing, other people's money. They are omnivorous creatures. Whatever makes the most money to the developer in the shortest time with the least risk is what they do. It's just a fact. I've worked with a lot of developers over the years. It's like little boys. Don't try to change their behavior. Try to get them to grow up. But that's the behavior. Understand what you're dealing with. If you want developers to develop affordable housing, make it worth their while. Reduce their risk. Give them higher leverage, or give them development advantages. One of my favorites is inclusionary zoning or density bonus, which says you have a certain amount of density that you could put on the site, but if you put affordable housing in it, the site can go higher. And that makes money in the air. On the one hand, they talk about we're not making any more land, but the higher up you go in the sky, that's really making land. Anybody who's worked in an office building, you're working in the sky, right? Okay. And in cities, as long as cities are two-dimensional, the infrastructure costs will massacre you. As cities can become three-dimensional, if you have the infrastructure, if you have good soil, if you have good structural materials like concrete, rebar, fast broadband, good elevators, reliable electricity, you can go vertical. The greenest city per capita is the highest vertical city. That's the irony, right? Because you're engineering your way up and you get high quality green vertical stuff. Now that's expensive, okay? So if we're trying to make affordable housing, the way we found it works, if you let developers develop in the CBD and go vertical and go more vertical, but only if they include affordable housing in it. That picture I showed at the beginning, I'm going to put it back up here for a second because I think it will, I want to illustrate it, okay? I want to go to this question. Whoops. Go back. No, hold on a second. My bad. Okay, here we go. All right, so for this picture, okay? We're getting a national class developer to undertake to demolish these 1,100 units. with not too much public money. How are they doing that? How are they doing that? How could that possibly be the case? Well, step one, we're going to, hold on a second, let me fix it so I go back to the front one. Pay no attention to the man behind the curtain. This is just getting something set up at the beginning. Go back to the beginning. There's the beginning. No, go back to the beginning. As I say, pay no attention. There we go. From current slide, there we go. Share screen, like Penn and Teller. There we go. From the beginning. Boom. Okay. This is being done with basically no federal government money. How? Where you see 1,100 apartments now, there will be 2,700 apartments. So there will be 1,600 new apartments built in effect on top of these, because these will all be demolished and there will be higher housing. There will also, you'll be pleased to know, there will also be very high green and sustainable stuff, because this will be rental and the developer will get the benefit of the savings because it will be less energy consuming. Okay. Other things that made this transaction work, there are 10 hectares of land that's going into this transaction for zero money. The city is providing $100 million plus or minus of infrastructure to replat the streets and things of that sort. Okay. There's going to be favorable financing, cheap loans. We've talked about cheap loans before. And there will be, all of you who are asking the construction questions, this will be modern modular construction. So the housing that will rise on this site, there will be a factory about 25 miles south of Boston in which room units are made, kitchen units, bathroom units, all this other kind of stuff. They will be put into containers like container trucks, trucked to the site, and the term is pick and place, right? So that they have a big crane, they lift up a box, they put the box in position on the fourth floor, they open up the box, they build the walls, ba-bump, 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 do it after that way. Every single one of those nifty little innovations is necessary to make this whole thing work. It's still hideously, oh, and then the other part is that the market units are going to generate a lot of profit, and the profit from the market units gets plowed back into making the lower income units affordable. It is a massive amount of financial engineering. And the reason I know it so well is because I've been working on it for 4 years. Count them, 4 years. And in those 4 years, I've been working for the tenants, the poor people who live there. So going back to your question about how you get developers to do it, you make it worthwhile and you design a program in which they can make as much profit for as little risk doing that as doing a high rise. And that's where you need people like Rizvi and me and others like us who will apply the land use economics and figure it out and make a deal that's worthwhile for the developer. Okay, so Dr. Fariha, I'm conscious of the fact that we theoretically have 4 minutes to go. I'm also conscious of the fact that you're going to be able to break your fast in about 30 minutes. I can stay on until 1/4 past the hour, but I don't want to hold the students if the students don't want to be held. So it's over to you and to Mariam for questions. I can stay longer. It's up to you.
So what did so we can have like 10 minutes more. So I can like combine few questions and throw it to you. So the question from Ahmed Ashfaq is like it relates to the previous comment you have made, that how affordable housing affect homelessness, and also how can we manage the maximum demand of housing. So to go vertical is the answer to make it like convenient for everyone. So the next would be from Asad Ali Lodi, that would that be okay to provide people with land or plots instead of built houses, which are usually high in prices? What consequences can be faced by doing so?
Okay. There's 3 or 4 questions there, and I've scribbled notes in a hurry. On the last one, on lands and plots, if you have not run into our mutual friend Tasneem Siddiqui, I recommend it because he was doing new towns on a sites and stands basis in Pakistan. I'll have to hunt down the additional context of him, but it's Tasneem Siddiqui. I'm sure you'll be able to find his name. He's doing it someplace in Pakistan. I don't remember where. Let me go back to the homelessness thing first, because it first of all, homelessness is an urban phenomenon, very significant. It's much less common in the rural environment because in the rural environment, you can self-build something that isn't much, but it's a roof over your head. In the urban environment, homelessness consistently arises when urbanization is fast and the city has only limited size. Homelessness is also more prevalent when the climate will tolerate it. So for example, Alaska, we have there's a significant homeless challenge, but there aren't many of them because, to be crude about it, if you're outside in the winter in Alaska, you will freeze to death. Okay. So the first challenge that you have is homelessness arises in tight quarters urban environment. Second challenge, there are some people who have had bad luck in their lives and whose ability to earn money is negligible. They just don't earn much money at all. They can never be housed just on a supply side solution. That is, it is never possible to create housing that is cheap enough so that what they can afford to pay will enable them to live, let's just call it a human life. Those people have to be cared for as part of the social welfare system. So that's a welfare problem or a poverty problem. The third issue, particularly in the United States, I have no opinion about Pakistan, I don't know enough about it, is that in America, a very substantial portion of the homeless, the chronic homeless, they are men, they have mental health issues or drug addiction. So the homelessness is unfortunately a symptom of a much worse human problem. There is a tendency, even in America, to think, let's get the homeless off the streets and that will solve the problem. And there's some truth to that. You can't get better in your life unless you have a stable roof over your head. But the other half of it is you can have a stable roof over your head and your life doesn't get any better unless you get off of whatever you're addicted to, or if you've got a mental health problem, unless you're one of the lucky people who are able to recover from a mental health problem. Those folks, it's particularly tragic. We have something here called permanent supportive housing, which can help. I'm big on trying to avoid people becoming chronically addicted to drugs because you see lives ruined and then you see the kids' lives ruined. We have homeless shelters, but they have to be tied with detoxification, getting people rehab, getting them out of their addiction. And you have to, yep, I see the note that you can see homelessness near the White House and near Downing Street. It's absolutely true. The richer the city, the more likely it is that there is homelessness very close by, unfortunately. So it is a protracted challenge, but it's not just a housing problem. It's housing plus genuinely wanting to help people fix their lives, and then the people have to want their lives to be fixed. So I will mention that one. As to the issue of going vertical, I think you have to go vertical, and my rule of thumb is that you can intermix 20 to 25% low or even very low income tenants into an otherwise market development, and it will work just fine. You know, the tenants have to have the same rules and the same behavior requirements that everybody else has, but you can blend them in. It does not have an impact. Above 25%, it's a problem. But what that means is you have to disperse the low income. You have the term in the US is deconcentrate poverty. You have to distribute people into society. Let them not be ghettoized. And then lastly, lands and plots, it's a fantastic idea for peri-urban environments if the land development is well done and the trunk infra is put in. There's a fellow researcher by the name of Shlomo Angel who coined a term that I love to use, a grid city of dirt roads. Give people a clear plot, give them an address, give them a concrete slab on a secure foundation and a basic core house that they can improve that has a certain amount of structural integrity to it, and then work with them on housing microfinance or incremental improvement and give them a path to secure title and formality at the end of a 2 or 3 or 5 year gradual home improvement construction program. I said before that you need to formalize the informal. You need to embrace the informal and give people a chance to improve their housing, because people's enterprise for their children is a very powerful force and should never be left idle. So make it possible for people to feel that by investing in their home, they're investing in their future and their children's future, and they will do it. And then reward them with formality of title.
So the
I note, by the way, that somebody put a message in the chat about the pre-calculated financial metrics, and you saw a sample
yeah.
at. I will tell you that guide star number and profile, that's Affordable Housing Institute. So Ali Raza, full marks to you. You found our website, or sorry, you found our IRS 990 filings. That's our
I
IRS
took
ID.
them
So
with your videos actually, and they already know what AHI do. So they formally know you already. So this is a question from Halima Shahed. There are people who are already residing in informal housing. So how could you tackle with them to give them formal or affordable with their residence still there? It's a tricky one.
the first thing I think of it this way. Bit by bit, the informally housed become part of the city. First of all, I want them to be counted. I want them to have the equivalent of an identity card. I want them to be able to vote. I want them to have voice in their society, right? So even if you live informally, you should be able to vote in the elections. I don't care how weird your elections are. Everybody's elections are weird, okay? Second, I want them to have a street address, a place that mail can be delivered and received and sent from, because a street address is a formal recognition by the Postal Service that you have a certain, that the place has some permanence to it. So that's very important. You can vote and I can find you. The next thing is I want them to be on the public transportation network. And if it isn't on the buses or close to the buses, if there are regular, the equivalent of taxi routes, what they call taxis in Africa, right? Those 12-seater or 15-seater Toyota minivans that hold 25 people. If there are regular routes that run, I want them, in short, to be woven into the fabric of the city, even if it's the informal fabric. The fourth thing is I want them, okay. The fourth thing is I want them. Okay, somebody's a little excited and it's not me. The fourth thing I want is for them to be able to establish businesses and earn money in. Mansour Ahmad, could you be muted, please? Okay, thank you. Mansour took care of it. I want them to be able to earn money in their community legally. I want them to be home-based workers or manufacturers or repair shops. I want the informal community to have an identity and a certain amount of economy. I want it to have mosques. I want it to start to feel like a community, and I want to see that people are able to invest money in making that community more durable. My message to informal communities is always be visible, be connected to each other, be durable, And eventually the city will decide it is better to bring you into the cadastre and give you title to the property that you have occupied for lo these many years or decades than to try to pretend that you're going to go away. Because in reality, you're not going to go away. Sooner or later, your informal neighborhood will become part of the formal city. The more you invest as if you're here to stay, the sooner the, the city councilors and the media will start to say, okay, you really are here to stay.
So the next one is from Muhammad Usman, and it's how government get benefits or revenue from this affordable or low income housing. So he.
Well, first of all, yep, good question. First of all, government benefits from economic activity in the city, period. There are sales taxes, there are employment taxes, there are merchants. You know, poor people who earn informal money spend it in formal shops. People who get revenue in formal shops pay formal taxes. The city gets richer as the people in the city get richer. That's first idea. Second idea, in general, if you are able to tax land or tax property with a real estate tax assessment of some kind or another, and I don't know the situation in Pakistan, but if you have an annual tax on property, 1%, 1.5%, doesn't have to be a lot, that becomes a very substantial revenue source. In the United States, for example, local taxes, property taxes, pay for anywhere from 40 to 80% of the local municipal budget. And in the United States, the local municipal budget pays for schools, police, firefighters. Okay, so there's local autonomy and local services that are paid for by the taxes on property. And as property becomes formal, it becomes possible to tax it. So my answer is the city invisibly benefits by economic development, visibly benefits from increased, semi-visibly benefits from taxes on the businesses that arise in the property in the city, and formally benefits from real estate taxes. And all of that uplift can be calculated, by the way. And it's an argument I make uh, often because people see the expenditure cost of affordable housing, but they don't see the revenue associated with it. They just take advantage of it.
So it's from the topper of the class, Muzammil. The inflation directly disturbs the loan payments.
Yep.
So it is in the developing countries. So how could we could resolve this effect directly on the living of these low income people?
Oh, that's a really good question. And the answer is it's easy to say and hard to do. Okay, here's the basic idea. Poor people need certainty in their monthly payment for housing, whether it's a rental payment or a mortgage owned payment. The poor people cannot financially tolerate big volatility in their monthly payment. The $10 phrase for it, if you're an economist type, is the poor cannot hedge exogenous risk. Okay? So if we're going to lend money to poor people, the most important thing is that the monthly payment on that loan not rise abruptly. Because if it rises abruptly, they have no cushion, no shock absorber. They go into default. And default on a mortgage loan is one of the most awful financial things there can be because it goes right to your housing and your eviction. It is therefore possible to do one of two things. One is you can have a fixed interest rate loan, which we'll come back to in a second. Or the second thing is you can have a variable interest rate loan with a fixed payment, and the increased payment is taken care of in some other way. A fixed rate loan requires what's called in the trade a reliable long-term yield curve. What I'm doing here is this is 1 year, this is 2 years, this is 5 years. If you find a graph, you can just Google yield curve and you'll find a thing that shows that the longer you borrow money for, the higher the interest rate you pay. And that's because the capital markets don't trust government. They think inflation and interest rate will go up. Okay. So in general, if you want a fixed rate loan in a country where the currency is not stable, it will be a very short tenor loan. And that means it's a very big debt service constant. I apologize for talking like a financier. If you want to make that loan stretch out for a long period of time, either you must directly have a government loan with a fixed interest rate, which means the central bank and the Ministry of Finance take the risk, or you have a private lender do it, in which case there has to be a very strong market with a hard currency and a low slope yield curve. Alternatively, as I've said before, you can do it where the increase in payments accrues toward the end. That's risky. Or you can have an interest rate subsidy that the government pays to keep the customer's payment at a low level. That's risky too. But ultimately, if you're in a situation where you have unreliable and high interest rates, you cannot create affordable home ownership unless the government takes the interest rate risk. You can never make affordability work if the private market is taking interest rate risk, because it will cost too much. And if you put the interest rate risk on the poor people, it'll work for a little while. And as soon as the market goes bad, everybody will go into default. That happened in South Africa right after full democracy. And it was just catastrophic for the banks and catastrophic for the politics and everything else. It's hard as heck. And I remember when we were doing the work that we did with DFID on Pakistan, I wrote a page and a half into our report that said, you cannot have a good long-term housing policy unless interest rates are stable and are under control. So since we're housing people, I'm going to assume that that happens, because otherwise I can't give you a policy that will make any sense and work. It's a risk I cannot hedge.
So there are series of comments from Ahmed Masood Saab. He is working in Phuket and Nespa, big construction company. So how government can make land available at cheaper rates to low income, and then in market economy where everyone is working to earn money, including government, how can low income can get decent housing at affordable price? Then he further said that our public sector needs to change the mindset because every housing program ended in a failure because of lack of political will and serious policy flaws.
Well, let me start with the
So,
last one, the editorial comment.
mhm.
To get a good housing policy, you need commitment at the top level of government that it's going to be an investment and it's going to produce returns slowly, not instantly. You need commitment at the top and you need consistency in it. You need the housing policy not to change every 3 to 4 years. If you don't do that, you're never going to get there. It's a slow growing thing. That's the first thing. The second thing is how do you get land cheaply into the hands of poor people? I'm a big, aside from legal mechanisms, and there are things like community land trust, which I won't bother to describe. I don't know whether you guys would do it, but I like faith-based institutions. If the mosque or the church owns the land and is committed to building housing for the parishioners or the faithful, then you have what I call a mission-oriented developer or a mission-oriented landlord. Throughout the history of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, there is a tradition that you have to provide housing for the poor and that it's part of your faith. It's part of zakat. Okay, it's one of the things you can use zakat for. I believe that people of faith should embrace that and say it's part of what we do for the faithful. And we do it because God tells us to. And so if we want to have affordable housing, we have something that is run by the mosque or an instrumentality of the mosque. You can have a, I'll get the term wrong, the nizam, you can put it in waqf. That's another one, by the way, Rizvi, that I've worked with in some contexts, establishing waqfs for affordable housing, because you put the land in permanent entitlement and you have the nizam and you run the royalties off of that. I would also encourage some of Pakistan's richest people to establish waqfs and establish foundations, whether they're Islamic or otherwise, to create affordable housing, because you have to do it You have to do it for a mission for your fellow man or woman. You have to do it for a mission for your fellow human being. To me, they're the best place to start, particularly if there's lack of confidence in government or lack of consistency in government. People who believe in eternal life are more likely to be consistent in their behavior than people who are just worrying about quarterly earnings.
There's
Dr.
someone
Fariha, if
to
you so
answer.
permit, I have
Yeah,
very quick observations, if you so permit.
yeah, sure.
I think you did a tremendous job in explaining lots of things, and this coming the rich people forward. We had also in the program developed a concept of sponsor a shelter foundation,
Oh,
meaning the
good.
rich
Yes.
people will set up that platform where we don't have to sponsor the entire house, but maybe for first 5 or 10 years, could share the rich people the installment payment or half of the installment payment. And this is being worked out. The concept I proposed to the Prime Minister is agreed to. And I think you are absolutely right that this is where the rich people have to come forward to empower the poor people. And this is next. The second thing what we are doing is that we are developing, we have developed a national platform for housing research where we have involved the academia, all the universities, where they are doing research on construction materials and construction technologies so that we could address the low income housing, but also at the same time a decent housing.
Good.
So
Very
that's
good.
where,
Excellent.
yeah. The third thing, what we are trying to do is we are trying to promote, which Prime Minister is also very much convinced. You see, in Pakistan, the 1970, the population was 50 million. Today is 222 million, meaning
Yep.
we have to have now accommodate with the same land 4 times the people. And by turn of the century, population by 2050, 60, population is likely to be 370 or something. Meaning, as you said, very rightly said, that the same land had to accommodate 4 people, then it has to accommodate 8 people, meaning high-rise combination. So I fully agree with you, and I think excellent presentation you made on all the sides of the thing, and you know it well. So kind of you, David, you spent time.
Well, thank you, Rizvi. I'm delighted to hear that you liked it.
So David, it's the last like series of comment from Forum Farid, and he is a vice chairman of town planners in Pakistan. So it's like about the house size that you have mentioned. That when it comes to buy a house, no one consider home less than a 2,000 square feet, even if it is a flat. So how can we bring economy of scale here? And people who
Oh,
already own land or a house in a parental district, they need to sell those places, lands kept vacant and underutilized just because owner migrated to some metropolitan area. So we need to change the mindset of 5 to 6 bed house, which take ages to construct and hard to sell, even or get housing finance. So Pakistan need almost 2 million housing units every year based on current demography. So it's
okay.
based on.
That's a whole pile of things. Let me see what I can do here. I've done a lot of work in Saudi and Abu Dhabi and Dubai, and what Khurram Farid was describing about everybody wants a 200 square meter villa was absolutely the mentality in those places. And indeed, Saudi is the extreme example of this. I don't know, Khurram, if you've been to Riyadh or been to Jeddah, but they went whole hog into a welfare society where everybody was entitled as a birthright to 200 square meter villa on, let's say, a quarter of a hectare of land. I mean, or maybe an eighth of a hectare of land, big site of land. And the result was they built Riyadh completely flat, like out and out and out and out. The infrastructure costs destroyed them, and also a horizontal villa model with high walls and the whole bit is not actually a very social environment. It's everybody in their own little compound. And the compounds, as Khurram was in fact saying, had big households. They were 3-generation households. And the mentality was, that's the dream home, and that's the only home you move into. What I've been trying to push, with not much success, is the idea that the amount of housing you have changes at your time in life. When you're young, when you're starting out, live in 50 square meters. You, your spouse, it's great. You're close to work. You're both working. You're building your career. You don't have a lot of assets. You want to start your own family. Then you get the first kid, the second kid, move from the 50 square meter flat to a 90 square meter flat. Then 3, 5, 7 years later, when you're more settled and you know what your job is, then you move to 100 or 150 square meter townhouse or villa or condo or whatever. That works if you have different typologies of housing that are constantly being produced. And if people are able to move from one to another and recover the equity that they have put in to the earlier house when they move to the successor house. As you diversify the typology and you build different typologies for households at different stages in life, then you will start to see the buying and selling of homes. Not that they're a pure commodity, but that you live in more than one of them over the course of your life. And you've got a bunch of students who have moved from home to university and live in a university for a while. So we have practice at that. The last thing you said, it's a two-parter. One part is that at the end of life, when you're older, you don't need 250 square meters. Maybe you want to move into something. Maybe you want to move closer to your children, and you ideally sell that home, so that the term in the U.S. and UK is empty nesters. If you're an empty nester, it makes sense to step down in the housing because you actually don't want the burden and you'd like other people to live in it. The second is rural to urban immigration is one way and virtually irreversible. Okay. Abu Dhabi was the place that I saw this most clearly. Grandfather grew up in Al Ain and he thought he was in Al Ain. The kids grew up in Abu Dhabi City in a villa, and their kids grew up in Abu Dhabi City, went to school in London, came back and wanted to live downtown in a high rise. Okay. And the big villa in Al Ain is what's called in economics a stranded cost. It may be a villa we want to live in, but there are going to be fewer of them over time because the rural to urban migration is just irreversible. So as you're doing your urban planning, you have to plan where Rizvi was talking about in 30 years, you'll have 150 million more Pakistanis. They're going to want to live in the cities. They're not going to want to live in the country. So that you have to think not just about where your current housing stock is, but where the future stock should be built. You should build for growth, and the growth will be younger, better educated, smaller households, more focused on network and broadband and connectedness, and less focused on the villa in the mountains.
So I want permission from David if I can end up the meeting and I can share the recording to the participants if needed. So David, I think I have covered all the questions. I tried my best to like compile the two
They
in
asked an
one.
awful lot of questions.
Yeah, so it's like I merged a couple of questions. So sorry for that. I have lost any important question between that. And thank you, Zagam Saab and Arif Changezi Saab for joining in, and Ahmed Masood Saab and Forum Farid Saab, and the students that who are so much hungry at that time. So I want to like end up the meeting with a lot of thanks to David who spare his time in his busy schedules. So, David, any last comment for the students?
Yes, I tried to capture the chat. It's a lengthy chat. I have put my email address into the chat. My email address is also on the slides. I mean it when I say email me. I always respond, not always as fast as you'd like and not always as helpfully, but I do always respond. I really
Yeah,
appreciate the opportunity to talk.
Yeah, you
I really
always
appreciate
reply
the
back.
opportunity.
Mhm.
Okay, good. Anyway, thank you all. Go with God. Go get some food.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you to all participants. Thank you for coming.
Thanks.
David Smith.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Goodbye.